An elderly couple was handed a dead roadside motel worth $7 in back taxes by a great-nephew who wanted them gone. And the survey he ordered to prove it was worthless was the thing that ruined him. Walter Standish was 78 years old, and for 52 of those years, he had been married to the same woman, Norma, who could still tell you the exact day they'd planted the cottonwood outside their kitchen window in Ogallala, Nebraska, the 11th of April, 1974, the same week Walter had passed his state licensing exam to become a certified land surveyor. He'd worked 38 years for Keith County before retiring, the last 11 of them as the county assessor, the man whose signature went on every parcel boundary dispute between the Platte River and the South Dakota line. He could read a plat map the way other men read a newspaper. He had walked more fence lines in Keith County than any person living, and he had done it on foot, with a transit and a chain, long after the younger surveyors switched to GPS units. He privately considered cheating. Their daughter Linda had not visited in 14 months, the longest gap since she'd moved west in 1998, and Norma had stopped mentioning the gap out loud sometime around the 10-month mark, the way she'd learned to stop mentioning things that worried her without solving anything. It was not estrangement, not exactly. Linda called every other Sunday, dutiful and warm in the way of someone managing distance carefully. But Norma had noticed that the calls had gotten shorter since her granddaughter started high school, and she carried that the way she carried most things now, quietly, at the edge of her attention. The way you carry a low ache you've decided isn't yet worth mentioning to a doctor. Norma had kept the books for the county extension office for 29 years. She could add 4 columns of figures in her head faster than Walter's grandnephew Garrett could pull up a calculator app. And she never let anyone forget it, though she said it kindly, the way you'd correct a child's grammar. They had one surviving relative who called regularly, and it was not their own 2 children. Their son had died in a combine accident in 2009. Their daughter lived in Spokane and visited twice a year if the weather cooperated. It was Garrett Voss, 34 years old, their late nephew Earl's boy, a commercial real estate broker out of Lincoln who had spent the last 6 years building what he called a land portfolio out of foreclosed properties along Highway 30. Garrett called Walter every few months. He always asked about Walter's health first. He always mentioned, somewhere in the conversation, how much he admired what Walter and Norma had built. What they had built, mostly, was the Sandhill Motor Court, 11 rooms and an attached diner counter on 4 acres at the edge of town, purchased in 1986 with the last of Walter's surveying fees and run by Norma for 19 years until the interstate bypass killed the highway traffic in 2005. They had closed it, paid the taxes on it out of stubbornness for 2 decades since, and let the cottonwoods grow up through the gravel lot because neither of them could stand to sell something Norma had scrubbed and repapered with her own hands. In March, 11 weeks before Walter's 78th birthday, Garrett drove the 3 hours from Lincoln unannounced, carrying a leather folder and wearing a blazer that cost more than Walter's monthly Social Security check. "Uncle Walter," he said, setting the folder on the kitchen table where Walter had eaten breakfast every morning for 31 years. "I want to talk to you about the motel property." Doubleter had poured Garrett coffee before he sat down across from him, the way he poured coffee for anyone who came through his door, even now. "What about it? The county's been after you for back taxes again. I checked the records this morning before I drove out." Garrett opened the folder. Inside was a printout from the county treasurer's site, a parcel number Walter recognized from memory, and a delinquency total. "That's the 3rd notice. I know what it is, Garrett. I get the mail. I'm not trying to embarrass you." Garrett's voice had the particular gentleness of a man who has rehearsed being gentle. "I'm trying to help. You and Aunt Norma are 78. You're managing a property that's been condemned by the fire marshal twice. It's a liability. If something happened, if a kid got hurt messing around in there, if the roof came down on a trespasser, that liability comes back on you. Norma had come in from the garden and was standing in the doorway, taking off her gloves, finger by finger. "We've owned that property for 39 years, she said. "I know you have. And I think it's time to let it go with some dignity, instead of the county taking it for taxes and you getting nothing." Garrett slid a single sheet across the table. "I had it appraised. Quietly, so you wouldn't have to deal with strangers walking the lot. The building's a teardown. The land's floodplain adjacent, so it's restricted for new construction. After demo costs and clearing, the appraiser valued the whole 4 acres at negative equity. Nobody will buy it as is. I'm offering to take the deed, settle the back taxes myself, and you'll never have to think about it again." Walter looked at the appraisal. It had a logo he didn't recognize, and a signature he couldn't read. "Negative equity," he repeated. "I'll be honest with you, Uncle Walter, because I respect you too much not to be." Garrett's tell, if you were watching for it, was that he reached for sincerity with both hands right before he said something he'd already decided on. Weeks earlier, the property's worth $7. That's what the treasurer's office told me this morning when I asked what it would take to clear title outright instead of going through the tax sale. $7 in the back taxes assumed. I'll pay the $7. I'll pay the $2,200. You walk away clean, and you never get another delinquency notice as long as you live." Norma had not sat down. $7. It's not about the number, Aunt Norma. It's about you not carrying this anymore. Garrett had arrived that morning wearing a watch Walter recognized from a catalog Norma sometimes flipped through at the dentist's office, the kind that ran past $4,000. And Walter had noticed it the way he noticed most things, without saying anything about it. He noticed, too, that Garrett's blazer still had the faint crease lines of having come straight off a hanger that week, the kind of detail Norma would have called trying too hard to look like he wasn't trying, and that Garrett had used both of their first names exactly 4 times in 9 minutes. The practiced rhythm of a man who had learned somewhere that people relax when you say their name enough. Walter had spent 38 years putting his name on documents that determined what land was worth to the dollar, and something in the back of his mind, not suspicion exactly, not yet, or more like the particular itch he used to get when a property line on paper didn't match what he found in the field, told him to ask the one question he asked every landowner who'd ever come to him with a dispute: who ran the appraisal? A firm out of Lincoln I use for all my acquisitions. Does the appraisal mention the right-of-way? Garrett's pause was less than a second, and Walter, who had spent his career noticing the things people did in less than a second, noticed it. What? Right-of-way, the one along the eastern boundary, recorded 1962, before either of us was old enough to vote. Walter folded the appraisal closed. "I'll think about it." Garrett's gentleness held for exactly as long as it took him to realize Walter wasn't agreeing on the spot. "Uncle Walter, I don't want to push you, but the county sale is in 90 days. If we don't do this now, you lose the property and get nothing, and I can't stop that for you." He left the folder on the table when he drove back to Lincoln. Walter did not sign anything that week, or the next. He drove out to the motel 3 times over the following month, alone, telling Norma he was checking on the roof. And each time he walked the eastern boundary with a hand level and a 50-year-old steel tape he kept in the truck, the same tape he'd carried his entire working life. And each time he found the iron pin exactly where the 1962 plat said it should be, 11 inches below the surface, undisturbed. Norma had not forgotten what Garrett's voice had sounded like When he said, "Negative equity," the particular flatness of a number recited rather than calculated, and she brought it up twice that month while they were doing other things. Once while hanging laundry, once while Walter changed the oil in the truck, just as a fact she kept turning over. He didn't even look surprised when he said it, she told Walter the second time. A man who'd actually had an appraisal done would look at the number himself before he said it out loud. He just said it like he already knew it cold. Walter had noticed the same thing and had not said so, because saying it out loud felt like accusing a dead nephew's son of something he could not yet prove, and Walter Standish did not accuse people of things he could not prove. He had built 38 years of professional credibility on the specific discipline of never stating a boundary line until he had walked it himself, twice, with his own equipment, and he was not going to abandon that discipline now, just because the boundary in question was a family relationship instead of a parcel line. What he did instead in April was drive 40 minutes to the county clerk's office and request the full transaction history on every recorded conveyance bearing Garrett Voss's name as grantee over the previous 6 years. The clerk, a woman named Patty Olson, who had worked under Walter for 9 years before he retired, pulled the file without asking why, the way people who had worked for Walter Standish generally did, trusting that if Walter wanted something, there was a reason for it even if he hadn't said what the reason was. The list ran to 11 properties. 8 of them, by Walter's quick read of the parcel descriptions, sat somewhere in the broad sand and gravel formation that ran beneath most of the high terrace land along that stretch of the Platte. The same formation Walter had mapped in pieces over decades of survey work, long before anyone in Keith County particularly cared what was under their feet. Back when the only thing anyone wanted to know was where the fence should go. He did not say anything to Norma about the list yet. He folded it and put it in the glove compartment of the truck, the way he used to keep working notes there during his surveying years, where they would be close at hand but not yet announced. Garrett called again in May. This time there was no gentleness in his voice at all, just the flat efficiency of a man whose timeline was slipping. "Uncle Walter, I need an answer. I've got a buyer for the land lined up the second it clears, but the offer expires. What's the buyer want it for?" "Storage units, light industrial." "It doesn't matter. The point is the offer's real, and it's better than what the county auction will get you." "What's he offering?" A pause again, the same length as before. "That's between me and him. Until we close. Garrett, I taught county hearings for 11 years on what a fair number looks like for raw land in this county, and I have never once heard a buyer's representative refuse to tell the seller what the buyer's offering. That's not how a real negotiation works. That's how a man protects a number he doesn't want examined. I'm trying to help you, Uncle Walter. I don't know why you're making this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult. I'm asking a question you don't want to answer, and I think we both know the difference between those two things." Walter said he'd call him back. He never got the chance to, because 3 days later the fire marshal's office sent a notice, forwarded through Garrett, who Walter later learned had requested the inspection himself, declaring the Sandhill Motor Court an imminent public hazard, condemned for demolition within 60 days unless the owner could prove structural remediation was underway. Norma read the letter twice at the kitchen table and did not cry. She got up, went to the hall closet, and came back with the keys to the motel, which she had not touched in 4 years. "We're not signing anything," she said. "We're going to look at it ourselves." The Sandhill Motor Court sat 4 miles east of town on the old highway, the one that used to carry every car between Denver and Omaha before the interstate cut a straight line 40 minutes south of it in 1979. The 11 units ran in a single low row, cinder block painted a turquoise that had gone the color of old bruises. and the office sat at the near end with a sign, Sandhill Motor Court, Virginia, Kansas, that Walter had wired himself in 1986, and that still, astonishingly, lit up halfway. The gravel lot had gone to seed grass and 3 cottonwood saplings that had not been saplings in a decade. One of them had grown up through a gap in the concrete walk in front of Unit 6 and stood now as thick as Walter's forearm. The diner counter, visible through the office window, still had 4 stools bolted to the floor, vinyl split and curling, a coffee urn gone green with verdigris, and a calendar on the wall turned to March of the year they'd closed. The photograph on it a faded picture of a wheat field that nobody had looked at in 19 years. Norma went in first. The smell was dust and old grease and something mineral. Underneath it, the smell of a building that had stopped being heated and cooled by anything but the weather. She ran a finger along the counter, and it came away gray. She did not say anything about that. She walked behind the counter to where the till had been, opened the drawer that didn't lock anymore, and found a roll of order tickets, blank, still rubber-banded, exactly where she'd left them. She moved down the row of stools, 4 of them bolted to the floor in a line, and sat on the end one, the way she used to sit when she took her own break, at 4 in the afternoon, the slow hour before the supper rush. The vinyl had split along the seam, but held her weight the same as it always had. On the shelf below the register, she found a stack of guest receipts from 2004, carbon copies gone soft at the edges, the handwriting on top one hers, the date the 9th of October, a man named R. Sletton, who'd paid $18 for a single night and signed the bottom in a hand, so careless she remembered being annoyed by it at the time. She had not thought about R. Sletton in 21 years. She thought about him now, briefly, the way you think about a stranger's handwriting when nothing else is asking for your attention. "I want to see Unit 4, she said. Walter didn't ask why. Unit 4 had been hers, the room she'd kept made up for, whichever of her sisters came through. The only unit with the good mattress. The only one she'd papered herself with a pattern of small yellow flowers that she'd special ordered from a catalog in 1991. The wallpaper had bubbled in 2 corners from a roof leak. Walter had patched himself twice with materials that had not evidently held a 3rd time. But the bed frame was still there. The nightstand was still there. In the nightstand drawer, Norma found a paperback novel with a cracked spine, a church bulletin from a Sunday in October of 2004, and 40 cents in change. She picked up the 40 cents and held it in her palm for a moment. 2 dimes and 4 nickels, the particular weight of old coins that had sat untouched for 2 decades, and put it back exactly where she'd found it, in the same corner of the drawer, the way you'd put back something that belonged to someone who might still come looking for it. She had been keeping books for other people's money for 29 years at the extension office, and there was a discipline in her that did not let her pocket 40 cents that had been waiting in a drawer since before her own son died, even though there was no one left who would ever ask for it back. Walter spent his first hour at the property, the way he had spent every working hour of his career, at the boundaries, not the building. He walked the eastern line with the steel tape and a hand compass, the same line he'd checked alone 3 times that spring, and confirmed again what he already knew. The iron pin from the 1962 survey sat 11 inches under the sod, undisturbed, exactly 240 feet from the section corner. He stood over it for a long moment in the high plains wind, the kind that came across 400 miles of nothing and arrived at his collar with an edge to it even in May, and he thought about the fact that Garrett's appraiser, whoever they were, had apparently never walked this line at all. He thought, too, about his great-uncle Olaf, a man Walter had only known as a child gone before Walter was old enough to ask him a single useful question, who had nonetheless reached forward 64 years through a single piece of careful legal drafting to protect land he would never live to see developed. Walter had spent his career reading other men's old surveys, learning their habits of mind from the way they'd set their corners, and he recognized in the 1962 easement language the particular carefulness of a man who did not trust the future to be kind to whoever came after him. Walter had inherited that carefulness without ever being taught it directly. It had simply been in the family, the way height or eye color is in a family, passed down through deeds instead of blood. It was a county pickup, white with the Keith County seal on the door, and the woman who got out of it was younger than Walter's granddaughter would have been if his son had lived to have one, 26, 27, dressed for field work in canvas pants and a windbreaker, carrying a clipboard and a GPS unit that looked considerably newer than anything Walter had ever owned. "Mr. Standish." She said it like she already knew the answer. "I'm Dana Pruitt. I do title research for the county recorder's office. Well, contract work, mostly for the title companies now, but I still do some county work when they're backed up." She held up the clipboard. End quote. "I got a call from a Garrett Voss asking me to pull a clean title report on this parcel. Said it was urgent. Said you were planning to convey it to him this month." Walter felt something settle in his chest, the particular stillness he used to feel in the field right before he found a discrepancy nobody else had noticed. "Did you pull it?" "I started to. That's actually why I drove out. I wanted to see the parcel myself before I finished the report because something didn't sit right in the chain of title." She flipped to a page on her clipboard. "Your eastern boundary's got an old right-of-way recorded against it from 1962. A pipeline easement, but it's worded strange. It doesn't just grant passage, it reserves a percentage interest in any future subsurface lease income to the original grantor's heirs. I've seen maybe 3 of these in 11 years of doing this work." "I know about the right-of-way," Walter said. "I surveyed half this county for 38 years. I know exactly what's on that line." Dana looked at him for a second too long, the way people did when they were recalibrating who they were talking to. "Then you probably already know that the parcel north of you, the Halverson Quarter, leased mineral and aggregate rights to a sand and gravel operation 2 years ago. $41,000 a year, and climbing, because the South Platte aquifer sand under this whole stretch is worth more right now than it's been worth in decades. What with all the construction going on along the interstate corridor." Norma had come out of Unit 4 and was standing in the doorway, the paperback still in her hand. "And our motel sits on the same line as the Halverson place." "Your motel sits on the exact same gravel seam," Dana said. "That's what didn't sit right," Mr. Voss told me. "The parcel had negative equity. I don't see how anybody reaches that number with this easement attached. Unless whoever did the appraisal either didn't pull the full title history or didn't want to find what was in it." Walter looked east, toward the Halverson Quarter. He couldn't see, but had surveyed twice in his career. Once in 1981 and once in 1998, and did the arithmetic he'd been doing without letting himself finish it for 2 months. 4 acres instead of 160. A smaller share of the gravel seam, certainly. But a share. "I'd like a copy of whatever you pull," he said. "All of it. And I'd like to know exactly what was in that appraisal Garrett showed me, because he said it had a number for the land, and the number was $7. Dana's face did something controlled and professional that didn't quite hide what she thought of that number. "I can get you the full title abstract by Friday. I can't speak to what's in a private appraisal I didn't write. But Mr. Standish, if you don't mind me saying, you should get your own appraisal done before you sign anything." "An honest one. I intend to," Walter said. "I was the county assessor for 11 years. I know exactly who does honest work in this county, and it isn't whoever Garrett's using." Dana came back on Friday with the abstract, 26 pages of it, and sat at Walter and Norma's kitchen table for 2 hours while Walter read every page with the particular slowness of a man checking another man's work. The easement was exactly what she described, recorded by a rancher named Olaf Halvorsen in 1962 when the original pipeline went through, granting passage but reserving 40% of any future subsurface lease income in perpetuity, running with the land to all subsequent owners. Nobody had touched it in 64 years because nobody had needed the gravel under it until the interstate corridor started eating sand by the truckload for concrete aggregate. "The thing that gets me," Dana said, tapping page 19, "is that this is recorded in the grantor-grantee index under Halvorsen, not under your parcel number. If you're doing a rush title search and you're only pulling by parcel, the way most of the cut-rate firms do it now to save time, you'd miss it completely. You'd see a floodplain restriction, a condemned structure, and a 4-acre parcel with no road frontage worth keeping. And you'd write the number Garrett's appraiser wrote $7, Norma said again. She had stopped saying it like a complaint and started saying it like evidence. Walter called the sand and gravel operator leasing the Halvorsen Quarter, a company out of North Platte, run by a man named Kurt Iverson, who Walter had known professionally for 20 years, back when Kurt was running surveying crews of his own, and asked him, plainly, what an additional 4-acre parcel on the same gravel seam, with the same easement language, would be worth to lease. Kurt didn't pretend not to know the number. "We've been wanting to extend the dig east for a year now. If the Sandhill parcel's got the same depth of deposit as Halvorsen's, and your easement reserves the same 40%, you're looking at $8,000 to $11,000 a year once we're operating on it. More once the aggregate price catches up to what it's doing along the corridor right now. I'll send a man out to core sample it if you want real numbers instead of my guess." Walter said yes. He did not call Garrett. For the first time in this entire business, he was the one deciding when the next conversation would happen, and he intended to decide it on his own schedule. The core sample came back the second week of June, 9 feet of clean construction-grade sand and gravel, beginning 4 feet below the surface across the eastern half of the parcel, consistent with the Halvorsen deposit and likely connected to it. Kurt's written estimate, conservative by his own description, put the lease value at $9,400 a year for the first decade, with renegotiation upward built into the contract template he used for every other landowner on that seam. Walter sat with that number for 3 days before he did anything with it. Then he drove to the county clerk's office on his own and pulled the original probate file from his great-uncle's estate in 1962. The file that had first divided the Halvorsen and Standish parcels, and confirmed in his own hand this time that the easement language had been copied verbatim from one deed to the next for 64 years without a single recording error. It was, as far as he could tell, airtight. He did not fix the roof. He did not pay the back taxes yet. He did not call Garrett. What he did on a Tuesday in late June with the wind running 30 miles an hour out of the northwest, the way it always did that time of year, was sit down at the kitchen table across from Norma and tell her in full exactly what the motel was worth and exactly what he intended to do about it. "We're not selling him the land," she said. "Not for $7. Not for $700,000. We're not selling him anything until he tells us what he actually knew." When he sat at this table in March, Garrett called twice that week, and Walter let both calls go to the machine. He had Dana send the full title abstract with the easement highlighted to a real estate attorney in North Platte, a woman named Carol Ash, who had drafted half the gravel leases on that stretch of the Platte and who read the file in 20 minutes and told Walter, flatly, that no honest appraiser working a rush title search would have produced a negative equity number on this parcel without either incompetence or intent. Garrett, for his part, had no idea any of this had happened. He drove out again in early July, the same blazer, a new folder, fully expecting the 90-day window to have done its work on two old people with a condemned building and no other options. He had already, Walter would later learn, signed a letter of intent with the storage unit developer contingent on clean title transferring by August. "Uncle Walter, I know the demolition deadline is stressful," Garrett said, sitting at the same kitchen table, the leather folder open to a new page. "I talked to the buyer. I got him up to $4,000, on top of covering the back taxes. That's real money for a parcel the county was going to take for nothing. I think you should take it before he walks." Walter let the silence sit for longer than was comfortable. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood. Norma had planted in 1974, the sound of it coming through the open kitchen window, the only thing either of them said for several seconds. $4,000, Walter said finally. "That's generous of him." "It is. I had to push for it. I'm sure you did." Walter folded his hands on the table the way he used to fold them across a county hearing table when a landowner tried to argue a boundary he'd already surveyed twice. "Garrett, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer it. Because I already know the answer, and I want to see if you'll tell me the truth. Anyway, did your appraiser pull the title abstract on this parcel, or just the parcel record?" Garrett's mouth opened slightly before anything came out of it, which was, in Walter's long professional experience, the most honest thing a person could do in a confrontation like this one. He does title pulls on every property. That's standard." "That's not what I asked you." Norma had not sat down again. She stood by the counter with her arms crossed, watching her grandnephew the way she used to watch a column of figures that didn't add up the first time through. "I want a week," Walter said. "I'm not signing in this kitchen today, and I'm not signing because a buyer's patience is running short. You'll have my answer in a week." Garrett's confidence, which had wavered for exactly as long as it took Walter to ask the question about the title pull, settled back into place almost as quickly as it had slipped. He was used to people needing a week. A week, in his experience, was what people asked for right before they signed. "Of course, Uncle Walter, take the week. I just don't want you to lose the buyer over it." He closed his folder, shook Walter's hand, kissed Norma on the cheek the way he always did, and drove back to Lincoln, fully believing the only thing standing between him and a closed deal was an old man's pride needing one more week to settle. He did not ask what was in Walter's folder. He did not think to. Carol Ash called the following Monday with a draft lease agreement and a number that made Norma sit down at the table for the first time in the conversation. Kurt Iverson's company was prepared to offer a signing bonus of $12,000 against future royalties if Walter would commit to a 15-year lease before the construction season ended, on top of the annual payments the core sample had already estimated. Carol had also pulled, at Walter's request, the full chain of title on every parcel Garrett had acquired over the past 6 years. Along Highway 3011 properties, all bought from elderly or distressed owners, all bought for a fraction of assessed value. 3 of them, Carol noted dryly. Sitting on the same general gravel formation that ran under half of Keith County. "I'm not accusing your nephew of anything I can prove," Carol said. "But I've drafted enough of these leases to recognize a pattern when I see one. If I were you, I'd want to know what he's done with the other 10. Walter spent 2 days making phone calls he hadn't planned on making. To a widow named Esther Kowalski, 2 towns over, who'd sold Garrett 40 acres for $800 in 2022 and who, when Walter asked her gently whether anyone had ever mentioned an easement, said, "No, nobody ever had," to a retired implement dealer named Roy Fenstermacher, who'd sold a shuttered dealership lot to Garrett for back tax value the year before and had no idea. Until Walter asked that there might have been anything underneath it worth checking. Norma found him at the kitchen table one night that week, with the legal pad spread open under the lamp, and instead of asking what he was doing, she sat down across from him and started reading the names out loud, one by one. Esther Kowalski, 40 acres, $800. She looked up. "I taught her daughter Sunday school for 6 years, Walter. I should call her." Walter told her she could, when he was ready, and Norma said she understood waiting. She had spent 52 years married to a man who never said a thing before he was certain of it, and she had long since stopped minding. The roof on Unit 4, the one with the yellow flowers, Norma had papered herself. Walter patched a third time that week, not because he intended to rent the room again, but because Norma had asked him to, quietly, one evening, without explaining why, and Walter had learned 52 years ago not to ask Norma why. When she asked for something that small, by the end of the week, Walter had made his decision. And it was not the decision Garrett was expecting. He was not going to sell the parcel to anyone. Not to Garrett, not to the storage unit developer, not to the county at the tax sale. He signed the 15-year lease with Kurt Iverson's company on a Thursday morning at Carol Ash's office in North Platte, with Norma sitting beside him, and the $12,000 signing bonus went straight into a savings account neither of them had touched in years. He paid the $2,200 in back taxes himself, in full the same week with a check drawn on that account, and he did it specifically so that no one, not Garrett, not the county, not anyone, could ever again tell him the property was about to be lost for non-payment. Then he called the fire marshal's office and asked formally what remediation would actually be required to lift the condemnation notice on the motor court, and was told that a structural engineer's letter certifying the roof and foundation, plus removal of 3 collapsed sections of block wall on the north side, would satisfy the order. Walter had built half the structures he'd surveyed boundaries for over the decades. In the years before surveying alone paid the bills, and he knew exactly which contractor in the county did honest block work for a fair price, because he'd inspected that contractor's work himself for 15 years before retiring. Garrett called on the 7th day, right on schedule, expecting an answer that would let the deal close before the storage unit buyer's patience ran out. "Uncle Walter, it's been a week. It has. So what's the answer?" Walter looked across the kitchen at Norma, who was shelling peas at the counter the way she had every June for 52 years, and felt something in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but close kin to both. "The answer is no, Garrett. We're keeping the property." There was a silence on the line that told Walter everything he needed to know about how certain Garrett had been. "Uncle Walter, I really think you're making a mistake. That building's condemned. The county can take it for taxes whether you want them to or not. And then you get nothing at all, not even the $7. The taxes are paid, Garrett. I paid them myself, Tuesday." Another silence, longer this time. "You paid $2,200 on a property that's worth $7. "It isn't worth $7, Walter said. "It was never worth $7. I think you might already know that, and I think we'll talk about exactly how much you know the next time I see you in person. Until then, I've got a roof to finish." He hung up the phone before Garrett could answer, which was not a thing Walter Standish had ever done to another human being in his life, and Norma, without looking up from the peas, said, "Good," in the particular tone she used when a column of figures had finally come out exactly right. If you've made it this far into Walter and Norma Standish's story, hit subscribe, because What happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Dana Pruitt drove out again that same week. Not for any title business this time, but because she said she'd been thinking about the place since she first saw it in May and wanted to see what Walter intended to do with it. She walked the eastern boundary with him on a Saturday morning, asking questions a much older surveyor would have asked about the soil composition, about whether the easement language could be challenged in court the way some landowners had tried with older pipeline grants. And Walter found himself enjoying the conversation in a way he hadn't enjoyed talking about land with anyone since he retired. Most people your age in this field don't know how to read an old plat by hand anymore, he told her. They run it through software and trust the output. Dana admitted she'd never actually learned to chain a line the old way, with a steel tape and 2 stakes, and Walter, without entirely deciding to, offered to show her right there, on a Saturday afternoon in early June, with the wind picking up out of the southwest the way it always did before a front came through. She came back twice more that summer for no reason connected to the title work at all. And on the second visit she brought a 6-pack of root beer and sat on an overturned bucket near the block wall while Walter worked, asking him about his 38 years with the county, about disputes he'd settled and ones he hadn't been able to, about the particular quiet satisfaction of being the person whose word on a boundary line nobody could argue with because he'd walked it himself. Walter found himself, that summer, doing something he had not done in years, talking through old county disputes out loud for an audience, the way he used to before the county commission when a boundary fight got contentious enough to need a public hearing. He told Dana about a fence line dispute from 1994 that had taken him into a courtroom in Lincoln, about a wealthy rancher from Wyoming who'd tried to claim 11 acres that belonged by every recorded document Walter could find to a Lakota family who'd held the parcel since an allotment patent in 1907, and how Walter's testimony, 3 days of it, had settled the matter in the family's favor. That's the only time in 38 years I ever felt like the job mattered, the way people think it matters, he told her. Most days you're just telling 2 neighbors where their fence actually goes. That day I was telling a corporation it didn't get to take something it wanted, just because it had better lawyers. Kurt Iverson called in late August with the news that a second sand and gravel company, smaller, out of Sydney, had inquired about the parcel after hearing through the regional aggregate trade about the new lease, wanting to know if the Standish acreage might support a second, deeper extraction phase once Kurt's contract terms allowed it. Walter told Kurt he wasn't interested in fielding competing offers. He had a 15-year agreement with a man he trusted, and trust, in his experience, was worth more than whatever marginal increase a bidding war might produce. Kurt told him that was in his considerable experience, leasing land across 6 counties, the single rarest thing a landowner had ever said to him. Walter spent those 3 weeks building. The block contractor, a man named Dale Peterson, who'd worked under Walter's inspections for 15 years before Walter retired, came out on a Monday with 2 laborers and pulled the 3 collapsed sections of North Wall in a single afternoon. And Walter stood watching with the particular satisfaction of a man seeing work done correctly by someone he'd trained to do it correctly. The new block went up over 4 days, Walter mixing mortar himself in the mornings before his hip stiffened past the point of being useful, handing tools and checking course lines with a level he'd owned since 1979. His right hip had been replaced 6 years earlier and ground audibly when the temperature dropped below 40, which it did twice that month. Even in late summer, the high plains weather never quite settling into one season before threatening another. He did not stop for it. He had learned, decades ago, not to stop for it. Dale's 2 laborers were young enough to be Walter's grandsons, and one of them, a 19-year-old named Cody, who'd grown up in town and had never once heard the motor court called anything but the haunted motel, asked Walter on the second day why he was bothering at his age with a building everyone in town had written off years ago. answered him the way he answered most questions from young men who hadn't yet learned to be careful with their certainty. Because everybody in town was wrong, and I've spent my whole working life being the one who proves people wrong about land. It's the only thing I was ever any good at, Cody, and I didn't stop being good at it just because I retired. Norma repapered Unit 4 a second time, the same pattern of small yellow flowers. Ordered this time from a website instead of a catalog, applied with the same care and considerably more patience than Norma had needed. The first time since there was no one checking in that week and no rush to have a room ready before a guest arrived. She worked through an entire Saturday on it, humming the way she used to hum when she ran the diner counter, and when Walter came in from the block work and saw her standing on a step stool with wallpaper paste on both forearms, he said nothing about it, because there was nothing to say that the wallpaper wasn't already saying. The structural engineer, a woman from Scottsbluff named Priya Anand, who'd certified half the grain elevators in the western part of the state, came out in late July, walked the new block work, checked the roof trusses Walter had repaired 3 separate times over 4 years, and signed the letter the fire marshal's office required without a single qualification. The condemnation notice was lifted on the 4th of August. Walter kept the letter in the same yellow legal pad folder where he kept everything else. The diner counter took longer than the building did. Norma wanted the coffee urn replaced rather than restored. "Some things you don't bring back, you replace," she said, in a tone that suggested she might have been talking about more than the urn. And the new one arrived from a restaurant supply company in Omaha in early September. Stainless and gleaming in a way that made the rest of the counter look older by comparison, until Walter sanded and refinished the countertop itself over 2 weekends. The same maple veneer laminate he'd installed, originally matched as closely as the supply house could manage 39 years later. He worked the laminate the way he'd watched the original installer work it in 1986, heating the seams with a borrowed heat gun and pressing them flat with a roller he'd had to drive to North Platte to find, because nobody in Ogallala stocked one anymore. Kurt Iverson's crew began core sampling the full eastern half of the parcel in October, confirming what the first sample had suggested, a deposit consistent with the Halverson seam, 9 feet deep, beginning 4 feet below grade, running the full 240 feet to the section corner Walter had confirmed with his own steel tape back in May. The lease amendment Carol Ash drafted that month adjusted the annual royalty upward to $10,100 based on the confirmed depth, with a renegotiation clause every 3 years tied to regional aggregate pricing, which Kurt told Walter, without much enthusiasm for saying it, was likely to keep climbing for at least another decade, given how much concrete the interstate corridor was eating. By November, the cottonwood that had grown up through the concrete walk in front of Unit 6 had to come out. Its roots had begun lifting the slab in a way that threatened the foundation underneath, and Walter cut it himself with a chainsaw he'd owned longer than he'd owned the property. Counting the rings afterward, out of the particular habit of a man who had spent his career counting things other people didn't think to count. 19 years, the same 19 years the motel had sat closed. Dana Pruitt came back twice that fall, once to update the title abstract with the recorded lease. Once, just to see the wallpaper which Norma had told her about on the phone, with more pride than she'd shown about anything since the place closed. "You did this in 8 months, Dana said, standing in the newly cleared lot, looking at the turquoise block wall Walter had repainted a deep barn red because he said he was tired of looking at a color that reminded him of being mocked. Most people your age would have taken the $7. Most people my age weren't the county assessor, Walter said. I know what things are worth. I spent 38 years finding out what other people missed. Word moved through the county the way it always did in a place where everyone had known everyone else's business for 3 generations. Roy Fenstermacher drove out unannounced in September, the same way Walter had once driven out to look at Roy's old implement dealership for the county, and stood in the cleared lot for a long while without saying much, until finally he said, I sold mine for nothing and didn't even think to ask what was under it. Walter didn't have an answer for that beyond telling him to call Carol Ash, which Roy eventually did, though the easement under his old dealership lot turned out to run too shallow to be worth fighting over. Esther Kowalski called Norma directly, twice, mostly just to talk, and Norma found herself doing for Esther what nobody had done for her. Sitting with the particular grief of being the one who didn't think to ask the right question, not because Esther had done anything wrong, but because nobody had ever taught her what questions there were to ask. By October, the diner counter had its new stainless coffee urn installed and running, though there was no one to serve coffee to yet. And Walter found himself standing behind the counter some mornings, out of old habit, looking at the row of bolted stools and the refinished countertop and feeling not nostalgia exactly, but something adjacent to it. A sense that the building had been waiting the way a tool waits in a drawer, ready the moment someone picked it back up. The work itself that autumn had a rhythm Walter recognized from decades of field work, early starts before the wind picked up, breaks timed to when his hip would tolerate them, the particular satisfaction of watching a measured thing come out exactly the way the math said it should. He reglazed all 11 window frames himself over 3 weekends, replacing cracked panes with glass cut to his own measurements at the hardware store in town where the clerk, a young man who'd never known the motel as anything but a condemned building on the old highway, asked him twice what he was building it back into. What it already was, Walter told him both times, which was not quite an answer, and not quite not one. His daughter in Spokane called twice that fall, longer conversations than usual, and Walter found himself telling her about the easement and the lease and the gravel seam in the kind of detail he hadn't bothered explaining to anyone outside the county in years. And she listened the way she used to listen as a girl, when he'd take her out on survey jobs in the summer, asking the right questions in the right order, and at the end of the second call, she said she might come out in July, once the worst of the summer heat had passed. By November, the cottonwood that had grown up through the concrete walk in front of Unit 6 had to come out. Its roots had begun lifting the slab in a way that threatened the foundation underneath, and Walter cut it himself with a chainsaw he'd owned longer than he'd owned the property, counting the rings afterward out of the particular habit of a man who had spent his career counting things other people didn't think to count. 19 years, the same 19 years the motel had sat closed. The first snow came on the 19th of November, early for the high plains even by Nebraska standards, and it caught the new red block and the repaired roof line and the lit-up half of the vacancy sign. Walter had finally fixed the other half, too. The same week he fixed the roof, in a way that made the motor court visible from the old highway for the first time in 19 years. A small, bright shape against the white of the lot and the gray of the sky. Garrett saw it from the road on his way through in December, on his way to a closing in Sydney that had nothing to do with his great-uncle, and pulled in without calling first. He stopped his car at the edge of the lot, and for a moment he did not get out. Walter, who was salting the new concrete walk in front of Unit 6, watched him sit there, through the windshield, looking at the red block wall, the lit sign, the cleared lot, the absence of the cottonwood that used to grow through the slab. Garrett got out slowly, his good coat not quite warm enough for the wind coming off the plains, and stood for a moment with one hand still on the open car door, the way a man stands when he isn't sure his legs have finished deciding what to do. "You painted it," he said finally. It was not a question exactly, though it had the shape of one. Norma picked the color. Walter kept salting the walk. Red's easier to see from the highway in winter than turquoise ever was. Garrett looked at the sign. Both halves of it lit now, and then at the new block, and then at Walter. and something crossed his face that Walter recognized from 38 years of watching landowners realize a survey had gone against them. "Uncle Walter, what is this?" Walter set the salt bucket down before answering. The motion deliberate. The way he used to set down a clipboard before delivering a hearing ruling he knew would not be welcome. A pickup passed on the old highway behind Garrett. Slow, the driver lifting 2 fingers off the wheel toward Walter the way people did out there, and Garrett did not seem to register it at all. "It's a motor court," Walter said. "Same as it's been since 1986. Norma's papered Unit 4 again if you want to see it." "I don't." Garrett stopped. "Started again. I don't understand. You told me you weren't going to do anything with it. I told you I wasn't going to sell it to you. I never said I wasn't going to do anything with it." Walter set the salt bucket down and stood up straight, the way his hip let him these days. Slow, but complete. "Kurt Iverson's leasing the eastern half for sand and gravel. $10,100 a year, going up every 3 years. The easement your appraiser missed, the one Olaf Halverson recorded in 1962, the one that runs with this land forever, that's what's paying for the new roof, Garrett. That and the back taxes I paid myself. The back taxes you told me would cost the county everything if I didn't sign over the deed to you for $7. Garrett's jaw worked once, and he did not say anything for several seconds. The wind moved through the gap where the cottonwood used to be. "I didn't know about the easement," he said finally, and it came out smaller than anything Walter had heard him say in 9 months of conversations. "I think you might not have known the specifics," Walter said. "But I called Esther Kowalski, and I called Roy Fenstermacher. 11 properties in 6 years, Garrett. All from people my age, all bought for less than what was sitting underneath them. I don't know if your appraiser's careless, or if you told him not to look too hard. I've decided I don't actually need to know which, because either way, you're not getting this parcel. And either way, I think you and I are done doing business." "Uncle Walter, I paid the taxes," Walter said. "I'm not condemned anymore. I got a 15-year lease with a renegotiation clause, and a structural engineer's letter, and a title abstract with your name nowhere on it. There's nothing left for you to offer me, Garrett. There's nothing left for you to take." Garrett stood there for a moment with his hands in the pockets of his good coat, looking past Walter at the building itself, at the new glazing in all 11 windows catching the late afternoon light, at the diner counter visible through the office glass. 4 turquoise stools in a row, and whatever he had driven up there expecting to say seemed to have gone out of him entirely. "What buyer?" he said, finally, the question coming out flat. There wasn't a buyer, was there? Not a real one. Walter did not answer that. He had decided, sometime in the autumn, that some questions a man had to answer for himself, and this was one of them. Garrett looked at the motor court one more time, really looked at it, the way he hadn't looked at anything in 9 months of driving out with folders and appraisals, and a buyer whose patience was always somehow about to run out. And then he got back in his car without saying anything else, and drove east toward Sydney, toward the closing that had nothing to do with any of this. And Walter watched the taillights go small against the snow and did not feel the thing he'd expected to feel, which was triumph, but instead felt something quieter, closer to the particular satisfaction of a survey. Came out exactly the way the original deed said it should. He did not hear from Garrett again that winter. Dana Pruitt told him the following spring that Garrett had quietly sold off 3 of the 11 properties he'd acquired the same way he tried to acquire the Sandhill parcel, after 2 of the original owners' families started asking questions of their own once word got around the county about what had happened with the Standish place. Walter did not take any satisfaction in that. Particularly, he had spent his career caring more about the lines being right than about who got embarrassed when they weren't. But he noted it the way he noted most things, in the careful hand he'd used his whole working life. Carol Ashe sent Walter a final letter in March, closing out the transaction file, and at the bottom of it, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that she'd had 3 other elderly landowners in the county call her office that winter, each wanting a title abstract pulled before they signed anything with a relative who'd come around with an appraisal and a deadline. "You've started something," she wrote. Walter read the line twice and then put the letter with the rest of the file, because he had never been a man who needed to be told he'd done something right by someone other than himself and his wife. Kurt's crew finished the first phase of extraction on the eastern half of the parcel by the following June, and the royalty check that arrived in July was larger than the estimate, because the aggregate price along the corridor had kept climbing the way Kurt had warned it might. Norma used part of it to replace the diner counter's stools, the vinyl finally beyond what reupholstering could fix, and ordered 4 new ones in the same turquoise the building used to be painted, which she thought was funny in a way she didn't explain to anyone but Walter. She also set aside $800, without telling Walter at first, for a plane ticket for their daughter, which she handed over in an envelope the week before the call confirming the July visit. The same week, Walter finished reglazing the last of the 11 windows. Their daughter arrived on a Thursday in July, 51 years old now, the same age Norma had been when they bought the place in 1986, and she stood in the gravel lot for a long moment before saying anything, looking at the red block and the lit sign and the row of new turquoise stools visible through the office window. "It looks like it did when I was small," she said, and Walter told her it looked better, because 19 years of neglect had taught him things about the building's bones that nobody knew when it was new. She stayed 5 days, slept in Unit 4 under the yellow wallpaper, helped Norma can the first tomatoes off the garden behind the house, and on her last morning asked Walter to walk the eastern boundary with her one more time before she drove to the airport in North Platte. The way she used to ask when she was 9 years old and thought a survey was the most interesting thing a person could do with a Saturday. They did not reopen the motor court as a motor court. There was no highway traffic left to justify it. At 79 and 76, they had no particular interest in running a business again. But they kept it standing, kept the lease running on the land beneath it, and Norma kept Unit 4 made up with the yellow flowers. For no reason either of them ever stated out loud, though Walter suspected it had something to do with their daughter in Spokane, who had started calling more often that year, and who had mentioned, twice now, that she might come out and stay a few days in the summer. The second winter after the confrontation, Walter walked the eastern boundary one more time, the same line he'd walked a dozen times that first year. The steel tape cold enough in his hands that he could feel it through his gloves. Pine the iron pin was still there, 11 inches under the frost-hardened sod, exactly 240 feet from the section corner, exactly where it had been since 1962. He did not need to check it. He checked it anyway, because that was the kind of man he had always been, and the line came out exactly the way it always had. Norma was waiting for him on the new walk, in front of Unit 6. When he came back, a thermos of coffee in her hands, the vacancy sign lit fully behind her, against the early dark, both halves working now, the red block catching what light there was. She handed him a cup without asking if he wanted one. "Well," she said. "Still where it's supposed to be," Walter said, and took the coffee. And they stood there together for a minute in the cold, looking at the motor court that everyone had once told them was worth $7, the sign lit and steady against the falling dark. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment. What would you have done in Walter Standish's position?